Hello, welcome to today's devotional. Hope you're having a good day here in Nova Scotia. It's a rainy day as we start to go into our fall. Uh, Forecasting a possible hurricane on the weekend, so we'll see what happens there. Hurricane, I think it's Fiona, I think, coming up the coast or coming up the Atlantic, and so not sure what the weekend will hold. But today it's a rainy day, kind of drizzly, but I kind of like that. So it's kind of fun for me. But anyways, we're looking at our devotional now, and we're going to go to Proverbs chapter 2, verse 5. So we're just going to read this verse, and then we're going to look at it. The chapter 2 has been sort of a similar statement as in chapter 1 of just calling us to wisdom, but by giving this idea of the outcomes of doing that. And so as I've said before, we're going to kind of try to approach this a little bit from the perspective of how it affects us emotionally. That's going to be part of what we're going to talk about in this chapter 2. So anyways, verse 5 says this. So after you pursue wisdom, after you, like we were saying the last couple of times, court wisdom, or seek wisdom like you might seek a treasure, right? And it says in verse 5, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. So that's cool. That's the outcome of the search, right? If you'll do this and really pursue wisdom from God, you will discern the fear of the Lord. What that means? Well, and discover the knowledge of God. So that one seems pretty obvious. Discovering the knowledge of God. That's the wisdom we're talking about. This idea of discerning the fear of the Lord. If you'll recall in chapter 1, it mentioned one of the key verses in chapter 1, I believe is verse 7, I think it was. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so this idea of the fear of the Lord is really important. So it'll say you will discover the knowledge of God. Well, you will discern. You will be able to detect or understand this beginning of knowledge, this fear of the Lord. You'll get it. And so I kind of see this verse almost being like a talking about an epiphany, right? So the old epiphany is a word in the Catholic calendar talking about Christ coming and so on, but the kind of the raw meaning of the word epiphany is this idea of having a sudden realization of the true nature of something, right? Like, so you can be thinking about something and you'll be like, oh, and you'll suddenly realize, or something will become very apparent all of a sudden, and you'll have what we say, you'll have an epiphany. Like, oh, I get it, right? So we also use this phrase in English, right? The light bulb moment. You have that light bulb moment that comes from the old cartoons where ding, the light bulb would appear over the head of the cartoon character, and they got an idea, right? Well, it's kind of like that. It's like the light bulb moment. Oh, I get it, right? Or solving a puzzle. You know what it's like when you solve a puzzle, or a riddle or something like that, and like, oh, what does this mean? And you're trying to figure it out, and then you're like, oh, and it suddenly realizes. You suddenly realize what's going on. For me, it was like that with that movie years ago. That movie that was so popular. What they call it, The Sixth Sense, or whatever they called it. Shyamalan's movie. And for me, halfway through the movie, I figured out what was happening, and it was just like this really neat moment of, I get it. I know what's happening in this movie. It's kind of like that. This verse is kind of saying that, right? It's like saying, if you seek wisdom, you pursue God's wisdom, and you do these things this way that Proverbs has been telling us to, then you're going to have this moment. You're going to come to these moments, actually, in your life. You're going to come to a place of discerning it, getting it, understanding, discovering it, getting the treasure, right? Winning the courtship with wisdom, and so that's kind of this verse saying that's the outcome. So that's really cool. So our questions today are 4 questions. So first one is, what does that mean for me practically? Well, it means that you'll discover wisdom and it'll change your life. The idea of this verse, in a very practical manner, is you will discover how to live life in a wise way, to live life the way God would lead you through it. And a lot of us, we want God's wisdom. We want God to guide us. A lot of people ask God, what should I do? And very often what we're looking for when we in our prayers ask God to tell me what to do, or what should I do in this situation, or whatever, we very often are looking for God to give us kind of like a sign from heaven of some sort, or some sort of a blazing sky signs and fires and explosions. And my camera's having a problem. Hang on here, try and refocus here. Hello. Sorry about that. I don't know why that's doing that. There we go. I apologize for that blurriness. Um, we kind of hope that God will give us these spectacular signs, and that we'll have these this very clear kind of fleece moments, if you know the story from the Old Testament, and so we hope that's how God will give us direction, and it's really not the way God tends to do that, right? God does that sometimes, but that's really rare. The majority of the time, the discerning of God, of the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God, is actually just this. It's the learning from his word how to live in the ways we call the ways of God, right? To live the way he has taught us. So we say, Lord, teach me your ways. And as God teaches us his ways, then we discern God's will. And so I mentioned, I think, in our last devotional, the idea of how in Romans chapter 12, it says that, we're transformed by the renewing of our mind, in the ways of God. Then that's how we discern the will of God, what's true and good, and so on and so forth. So finding the will of God practically, this verse is what it's saying very practically, is you'll discover wisdom. If you learn God's ways, you'll discover God's wisdom, and it will change your life, the way you live your life. And it's really very powerful. So for question 2, what does this mean for me emotionally? Now, I mentioned that in chapter 2, we're going to focus a bit on emotional. So in an emotional sense, what does this mean for me? And I guess I'll put it this way. There's a joy to discovery. There's a joy of the epiphany. There really is something kind of exciting and great when you solve a puzzle. I mean, you've experienced it, right? Like I mentioned in that movie that I was watching, and I realized halfway through, what was going on in the movie. And it was such a thrill to have discovered it. And I know what the answer. And it's like that. Like in our life, the more we get to understand God's wisdom, the more we'll have those moments of just like, I'm getting this. I'm on the right track. I know I am. And then that's a momentary joy, but it's still a wonderful thing. But then that gives way to a satisfaction, and the satisfied feeling of now I know what to do, and I can move forward with confidence, knowing that I'm choosing a course that is wise in the eyes of God. And that gives you a certain confidence and satisfaction, and ultimately a peace, right? A long-term peace of the world may be falling apart, there may be all kinds of troubles around me, but I've got God's wisdom in this, and so I'm walking in his path. So I have a confidence that even though it's hard, this is the best road for me, that there is no road better than this. So this I can go on in this, and I have the backing of God, so I go on in that, and so it gives me peace. So question 3, this verse literally uses the word fear. So how does that become joy and peace? And there could be some part of us that would be like, there seems to be an incongruity there. Discovering the fear of the Lord sounds like I should end up with fear, but that's misunderstanding the word. The word there that we translate to English fear, it means something a little deeper than like we might call anxiety. That kind of a fear. It's not meaning that. What it's talking about is this idea. It's a phrase. The fear of the Lord is the respect of God. It's a phrase that kind of means that respect of God, that I have a proper understanding of the danger of not being right with God, the danger of God's power itself if I don't treat him with respect. I can value going out in a boat on the ocean. It could be really fun. But if I don't respect the ocean, if I don't have a healthy fear of the ocean, knowing what the ocean could do, then I could sail off into a hurricane, and that would be the end of me. And so it's kind of like that. It's this idea that God is as good as, and God is perfectly good. He's good, but he's not this tame force in our life that we can just treat as if he's like a puppy dog. He's more properly understood as like a lion. Like, you want to be careful about this very good God, but he's powerful and he is righteous. And so his righteousness is actually something to respect. And so that's kind of the idea, is the respect. And it doesn't result in anxiety, that kind of fear. You don't live in the anxiety of God. You live in the peace and the satisfaction of God because of that respect, that fear of the Lord that you've grown in your life. It's sort of the difference like this. If you think of it this way, it's the difference of falling out of an airplane or parachuting out of an airplane, right? If I parachute out of an airplane, by the way, I would be anxious the entire trip down. But for those that like it, they love the thrill of falling through the atmosphere and having the parachute open and seeing the world from that beautiful perspective and all that goes with it. And they love that. But they wouldn't feel the same if they jumped out of the aircraft without a parachute. It's a very different feeling. And it's kind of like that. Like the fear of God is the parachute, descent of the parachute. And if we don't have the fear of God, then we're jumping out of the plane without the parachute. It's actually going to be terrifying. And so that's kind of the idea. It's a bit of a some weaknesses to that example, but it's enough, I think, for our purposes today. It's about having proper positioning with God. Question 4, our final question for today. What is the difference between godly wisdom and worldly wisdom? So this says you'll discover the fear of the Lord. You'll discover the knowledge of God, right? So this knowledge is a word often used in Proverbs to, speaking of this, what we might use, wisdom. So you'll discover this wisdom or this knowledge of God. So what's the difference of the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the world? Because in chapter 1, I acknowledge there is wisdom in the world. What's the difference? Well, big difference is the source, right? The world or God. And if you just think about the nature of those two things, the nature of humanity and the nature of God, which wisdom do you think is superior? The all-knowing God versus the very finite speculative knowledge of humans, or the unchanging God versus the very fickle world that we live in, the wisdom of the fickle world. I know a lot of people who put all their faith in science, for instance, as if it were all-knowing and unchanging. But I think any one of us have observed the many times that science has had to change the truth, had to change what was an absolute scientific fact. All of a sudden say, well, we've actually discovered it's a little different than we thought. And okay, so that's the wisdom of the world. It's not that it's empty, but there's something much more solid in the wisdom of God. And so there's a higher-ness and less subjectiveness. There's more of an objectiveness to the wisdom of God. And so pursuing God's wisdom is by far a superior place to be. And that's the difference, is the source, and thus the reliability of wisdom. It amazes me how many Christians pursue the world's wisdom to questions, and they don't pursue God. It's amazing to me how often. Once again, as a guy who has all these books and many more, and I've read a lot, and there's a lot of wisdom in the world, but it's amazing that how often Christians will be faced with a problem. They'll go off to hear what Dr. Phil has to say about it, and it's like, okay, there's some wisdom there, but why don't you pursue the wisdom of God? Because that wisdom comes from a really awesome source. It's the best. And so that's the thing. I see in chat there, God's wisdom is completely solid. Absolutely, right? So Jesus used that. That's great. Thanks for reminding me. Jesus uses this term, right? You build your life on his teachings. It's like building a house on a rock. Whereas if you build your life on other teachings, it's like building your house on sand. And when the flood comes, and it will come, well, the one on the rock stands. And that's the difference. Exactly the difference. So for today, for you, the application of this, I guess, would be to retrain your brain so that achieving the wisdom of God actually is the treasure you want. And it's the first place we go, not the last place we go, but the first place we go when we're trying to figure out life and what to do and how to live and how to be moral and how to be good and how to make just simply good, pragmatic choices. Let's just go to God first, his word first, discern the knowledge and the fear of the Lord first. And then human wisdom, we can sort that out through the lens of God rather than the other way around. Anyway, that's it. Tomorrow I will not be able to do my devotional. I have to be out of town for business, for not business, but for church work. But Thursday, God willing, I'll be back for the devotional on Thursday. So God bless each one of us. Help us to pursue your wisdom first, Lord. It is the great treasure. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. See you later.